Welcome, everyone. Just give us a few minutes for everyone to join us. And we just shared it on Facebook. And for those who are able to share on Facebook, please do so. And we'll have a few minutes for all those who are attending to be with us. We have quite a few registrants that have registered for this webinar. I'm really delighted and happy just to have my colleague, my friend, Jamil Khader to join us. I'm going to read his bio, which is important for us to really appreciate the depth of work and the continued contribution, scholarly as well as being, I say, organic scholar, meaning that his scholarship is connected both to unfolding events, but also to contribute to making a transformation. So Dr. Jamil Khader is a professor of English and Dean of Research at Bethlehem University. Professor Khader also serves as the editor-in-chief of the Bethlehem University Journal, a very important, really, journal for people to access and to see the type of research and contribution that is made. Before arriving at Bethlehem University in 2014, he taught at Belkent University in Ankara, Turkey, and at Staten University, DeLand, Florida, where he co-chaired the Diversity Council and chaired the Gender Studies program. Professor Khader received various awards, including 2 Fulbright fellowships and the Research Award, as well as the Student Advocate Award from Staten University. He is the author of cartographies of transnationalism in post-colonial feminism, geography, culture, identity, and politics, and is the co-editor of a collection of essays on the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek, entitled Zizek Now, Current Perspectives in Zizek Studies. He has numerous articles in post-colonial studies, also constantly writing in many of the publications, including our own publication, the Islamophobia Studies Journal, where he actually contributed to it. So welcome, Professor Jamil. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And really, I wanted to turn it to you. Just maybe give us a small biography about, well, where are you from in terms of your family history, and just locate us a little bit as a way of narrating, because our discussion today is about narrating Palestine and the multi-entanglement in there.
Hatem, everyone, good evening. Thank you very much for hosting me tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful and I'm honored to be here with you and with all of the colleagues and friends. I'm not going to repeat the information you said, but I just want to sort of point out that I was born in a village in the northern part of historical Palestine, close to Haifa, called Firidis. Firidis is an Arab village, predominantly Muslim, about 13,000 people. My family, or part of my family, descended to Firidis from Tantura, which is a little town on the coast of Palestine, about 15 miles south of Haifa city. You probably know about the history of Tantura. Some of you have heard about what was going on in 1948, in May 22nd and 23rd, with the notorious massacre that was committed by the Jewish terrorist group, the Haganah, and its armed wing, the Alexandroni Brigade. The Tantura massacre is considered one of the largest massacres in Palestine in 48. About 85 people were murdered, 85 men, and a couple more guards, plus about 300 men and 200 women were taken prisoners. Many of these women prisoners were actually taken to Firidis. I know my mom doesn't remember her birth date, but she always said that her mom told her that They were forced out of Tantura when she was only a month old.
Mm.
So the memory of Tantura is very personal to me at the personal and at the collective level. It has shaped the way that I think about the world, about the possibilities of the future, obviously, as well. In terms of the narrative, thinking about how or what to sort of um, try to understand the world around me um, from a very young age, especially in the context of, let's say, the fear that people had about speaking about Tantura. So I was always aware of the traumatic influence of the massacre on people, how people sort of refused to speak about the massacre, how people hesitated um, to talk about it for fear of the Mossad and everything else. Um, and you probably, some of you may remember what happened with Teddy Katz, who started reporting about the massacre in one of his master theses. He was a student of Ilan Papi at Haifa University, and it created really a huge debate and controversy in Israel over the alleged accuracy of his information. But later on, many people who participated in the massacre sort of admitted it. But in my village, there was always fear about talking about the Tantura massacre. People were really scared. They didn't want to be interrogated. One of the young women in my village, Ibtisam Marani, produced a film
Mm.
on the massacre and the way that it sort of fell into the unconscious of the people in my village, and the way that it really shaped their understanding of their Palestinian history and identities, as well as their status as second-class citizens of the state of Israel. But in that film called Paradise Lost,
Mhm.
she tries to pursue the story not only of the Tantura massacre, but also of a woman, political activist. Her name is Suad Hunaim. Suad lives now in Britain, but Suad was sort of persecuted. She was arrested. She was in jail, accused of belonging to a terrorist organization. But people sort of in the village refused to speak about both of them, about Suad and Tantura. And that was a kind of the hook of the film, dealing with the reasons why people refuse to engage with their stories because of that, again, environment of fear and persecution. And the all of those years in the in the 50s with the emergency rule, and um, people were always scared about sort of revealing their thoughts. Anyways, I think recently many young men and women in the village have been sort of reclaiming that sort of history and identity of their Palestinian origins, trying to deal with the conflicts and contradictions between their Palestinian national identity and their citizenship. But Tantura has been really central to many of the efforts.
Mm.
They have there's sort of this resurgence in their consciousness about this traumatic history. They have staged a few demonstrations in Tantura, plus collective remembrance days, trying to remember the and commemorate the massacre. I know that one of my mom's uncles died there. Many of my dad's relatives were forced out, and they lived in the camps and in the West Bank and in Syria and other places. So it's for me, that moment from a very young age sort of formed me in many ways. I got into cultural theory later on in my life, and I wrote
Mhm.
about that movie, Paradise Lost, and it was published in Post-Colonial Studies. But I was able to sort of theorize about it later to sort of understand the depth of what a traumatic history means for people like me and my family and the people of my village.
Mm.
So it was really the point of departure for me at the sort of that intellectual journey that I have had in my life.
And again, we're
Part,
talking about attempting to narrate Palestine, and
mhm.
your field is English literature, and the 1948, the Nakba, is a major, major event. If anything, is the historical crossroads for the Palestinians, both as scholars as well as individuals. So, how do you navigate that in your work? You began to discuss it, and in essence, also to constantly face the erasure. We're still trying to actually assert not only write history, but actually to reclaim it in a systematic and a scholarly way.
Yeah, I mean, what I, I'm always interested in these sort of contradictions and conflicts and tensions in any sort of narrative. And what I found, at least in this movie, which Paradise Lost, which was really kind of symptomatic of the way that people try to narrate traumatic history,
Mm.
because no traumatic history can be really narrated in a straightforward fashion. It's always full with interruptions and holes. It can never be narrated directly. The way that trauma falls into the unconscious of people. And ironically for me, I sort of started thinking about it a little bit more when I was reading about trauma theory and Holocaust studies.
Mm.
At the time when I was writing about it, I was teaching Dracula, and I ended up writing a paper on trauma theory, the first one on Bram Stoker's Dracula,
Mm.
and that got me into the movie Paradise Lost. After I watched it, I was like, oh, okay, there are so many interesting parallels here in the way that there's sort of the traumatic event, whether you want to call it in Dracula, the vampiric attack, or in Palestinian history, the ongoing Nakba. But the way that we deal and narrate these stories or these traumatic memories is really important to what I tried to say. Um, Again, when it comes to the ongoing Nakba, it's something that is central. The central to my work, the fact that the debate over Teddy Katz's thesis back then in the 80s and 90s, the fact that the Israeli establishment refused to recognize that a massacre was committed. It took them really years to
Mhm.
even begin to acknowledge the fact that a massacre was committed, is part of this sort of systematic erasure of Palestinian history. It's part of that sort of systematic erasure of the violent foundations of the Israeli state and its Zionist settler colonial project. So for me, when I talk about this, I prefer the term the ongoing Nakba, because
Mhm.
as we see today, it still really continues, whether it's in 48 or it's in the West Bank or in Gaza. The ongoing Nakba continues, and many times it continues behind the sort of the headlines of newspapers. When people are not really paying attention, many things are going on that change the facts on the ground. And that is really what is sort of dangerous about what's going on, and why we have to be sort of attentive and talk about the issue of the historical ramifications and the effect of this ongoing Nakba on us today. Now, when it comes to the issue of narrative, I'm kind of um, sort of thinking about it at that sort of literary and philosophical level.
Mhm.
Um, it has always sort of posed a challenge for me. Again, I'm not really,
What type of challenge?
well, I mean, narrative,
Mhm.
at least in I know Edward Said talked about, the permission to narrate and
Yeah.
whatever. But this was sort of a moment, a symptom of multicultural politics. Everybody gets a narrative, and Palestinians were claiming a narrative that becomes equivalent to the Israeli narrative. At least that's how it's framed. And then we are talking about these competing narratives, that everybody's is entitled to a narrative, even if you are a killer or a murderer, then you have your own narrative. What I was worried about is that there was always this kind of victimization Olympics, where people really tend to claim that sense of the ultimate victim of history, using hyperbolic language. And I know that Palestinians in particular are in a very delicate position when it comes to this issue, because, for some people, the atrocities of the Holocaust puts the Jewish people in that sort of situation of being the ultimate victim of history. But, can Palestinians claim that position vis-a-vis the Israelis, for example? It's a very difficult position, because in the end, and this is part of the debates that we have and we talk about.
Hmm.
Part of the problem for Palestinians when they try to speak even the sort of most simple facts about their history, without talking about violence or resistance, then it's automatically categorized as anti-Semitic, because you are really denying the Israeli narrative. And this is one of the reasons that we have always these challenges of facing Palestinians really sharing their story and talking about it. But for me, I've always wanted to sort of complicate that a little bit and think about it a little bit more. I don't want to sort of just have the Palestinian narrative replicate the mythologies and the assumptions and the strategies of the Israeli narrative or the
Hmm.
Zionist narrative. So I've always wanted to go beyond the sort of victimization rhetoric. I wanted to go beyond the political correctness rhetoric. I always wanted to go beyond identity politics. So, I attended a seminar or a webinar like this
Hmm.
a few months back about this issue of narrative. And, the reaction of participants were really interesting. And I sort of copied them. I'm not going to read them all, but, people were sort of talking about, I wish we have one unified Palestinian narrative that all Palestinians can sort of, support
A
and
mega
uh,
national narrative or a
national
singular.
one homogeneous narrative that.
Yeah.
And then, people talk about the importance of scientific and historical principles in writing that narrative. And to me, there's so much research, archaeological
Hmm.
research in particular, historical, that will help us redefine the narrative itself
Yeah.
and think beyond it, because we are at a stage where I agree with scholars like Noura Rikat. We
Hmm.
have to sort of rethink liberation in Palestine. I disagree with some of the things that she says, but or how to do it, and I have sort of my own take. And if I may share some good news, my book project prospectus called "Rethinking Palestine,"
Yes.
uh, "Rethinking Liberation in Israel Palestine," traversing the fantasies, received a contract from Routledge, so I'm going to be working on this, and I hope to be able to make a good argument about how we can really rethink this sort of liberation by sort of dealing with those fantasies that we have, with those problematic meta narratives that we have, that I mentioned before, the victimization, political correctness, and identity politics. So there are, it's important to tell the story, but we need to tell the story in a way that does not fall into the trap of the same mythologies and the Zionist Hasbara that we have been decrying and criticizing.
Well, maybe if you
For
could,
me, that we really need to think about it in a new way.
if I could maybe add a little bit, it seems that for us Palestinians trying to just deal with our history and the narrative is just it is that we're unable to move to actually begin to discuss the many contradictions that we have. We're always are not unable, but are subject to the colonial discourses that wants you to be an infantile stage in
Mhm.
your political development, your consciousness, in your economic development, social, cultural, religious. So we always have to constantly begin at point zero in and moving forward. So maybe that's
Oh,
also some of the issues in relations to colonize and colonizer discourse that we are subject to.
sure. I mean, if you read Noura's book or
Hmm.
her work, I mean, she really works hard on trying to sort of rethink this sort of binary of settler and native. But I was just sort of reviewing some of her work, and I thought that probably there also we need to think a little bit more about how we do it, because she argues that one of the ways that we can sort of go beyond this narrative and rethink liberation in Palestine and Israel is by incorporating Israel into a new vision of the Middle East. So they become Middle Easterners and not just simply European colonizers.
Mm-hmm.
But today, like this kind of argument backfires. I think, thinking about what's going on with Bahrain or UAE and all of this debate about normalization so
It
if you
skips
want
it
to
skips
think,
many steps in the sense that
sure,
are,
exactly.
are we ta- we have not yet moved into the post-colonial really period in Palestine. We're still in the colonial, and
Right.
then to embrace the colonizer as a part of your narrative and the construction in the post-colonial without going through a post-colonial decolonization, it creates a
Mhm.
very, complex, maintaining and stretching the status quo into the post-direct colonization.
Sure. I mean, there are many people who talk about decolonization in Palestine. Who obviously the term post-colonial is very problematic, and
Mm-hmm.
many people reject it. I myself began my career, with this fascination of Edward Said's work, and I really wanted to go and study with Said. We all, it was a buzzword, and we all sort of, as graduate students, wanted to write the post-colonial and be engaged with the post-colonial, but we know that it's really problematic. And for me, part of the problem today, and you probably know that I do use Zizek in many of
Mm-hmm.
my works. That critique of identity politics in particular, which really for me is very important. The emphasis on that ethnic particularity
Mm-hmm.
that can be in many ways detrimental. Nobody's saying you don't have a culture. We have a culture, but that culture does not define you in the end, in terms of that universal dimension of your identity as a human being within the system of global capitalism. I'm not
Sure.
claiming humanism here. I'm just saying that you as an individual, with your different affiliations and possibilities and potentialities, can transcend living in a particular space or being or being confined within the limits of one sort of culture.
Yeah.
As in my life, and as you mentioned briefly in the biography, I grew up inside Israel in 48. I moved the second part of my life to the United States. I studied there. I got married there. I worked there for many years. I lived in Turkey, and then I came back, and I, taught in the occupied Palestinian territories. So basically, I went wherever there was work and where I was needed. So that sort of sense of universality is within us, and that is really what we need to sort of
And,
capitalize on, in order to be able to transcend that the limitations of that discourse of particularity, acknowledging the universal dimension of your identity. And this is
maybe,
really part of
maybe,
why I was attracted to Slavo's work.
yeah.
Because as I was trying to say, I was very conscious of the limitations of post-coloniality early on in my life. I was just came across the other day one of my last articles that I published in a newspaper
Mm,
that came out from Nazareth, called Kul al-Arab,
mm,
was edited by the Palestinian poet Samih al-Qasim. I used to contribute some bi-weekly column there on culture, politics, whatever. And
mm,
that's before I went to the States. And my last article was about the Islamic movement.
mm,
And if you read it, you could see my sort of Marxist critique of post-coloniality and Islamic discourse and narrative.
mm,
But what was missing was sort of the Lacanian idea of the big other. There
mm,
is no big other, which at the time I thought that we could really find a solution in these sort of meta narratives that we have in the Middle East, whether it's nationalism or Islamism or whatever. Now that gave me the kind of, and I struggled, my book on transnational feminism was really, it took me a while. I got actually about 2 contracts, I think, when I was at Stetson for it. But I refused to complete. I signed the contract and I really wanted to do it. But every time that I finished writing it, I felt, no, that's not what I want to say.
mm.
There's something missing. Until I started reading Slavoj. So it took me about 12 years to
To
really
come back.
rewrite my first book in the way that I felt. Now, when I look at it, I feel satisfied. I feel happy. This is really where I stand ideologically and politically.
Yeah. Maybe let me
And
ask you a little bit on this.
yeah, sure.
I know that most likely you're aware of the Clash of Civilization narrative of
Huntington, sure.
Huntington and the critique of the whole victimization of the global South and
Mhm.
how to navigate in this the engagement of both to go beyond the particular while also not falling into uh, a universal that is Eurocentric, that
Or empty.
asserts that uh, that the normal universal in actually is not universal; it's particular that
Sure.
masquerading as a universal. So how do you navigate that?
Well, I very simple. I think Slavoj did all of the work, and I'm just sort of rewriting some of the things that he says.
Hmm.
It's really an issue where people sort of jump immediately when they talk about universality. They immediately conflate it with the anti-universalism of Eurocentrism
Hmm.
or Western culture. What Slavoj talks about, and I don't again make it into like sort of I'm lecturing on Slavoj now, but what I
But it's
believe that
important. It's an imprint on your intellectual contribution to
yes, it
say
is.
where do the lines meet. Yes.
It's true. I mean, I'm really indebted to him and for his support and mentoring. He's really a great guy. So basically the argument that he makes is that this sort of idea of empty universality, okay, it's not the universality, the radical emancipatory universality that he's calling for.
Hmm.
So when he talks about universality, he's talking about the universality from the perspective of those people who are excluded from the system, the people who are the worst off in the system, the disposable communities, the dispossessed, because these people really reflect the truth of the exploitation and the precarity in the global capitalist system today. And this is where that's the kind of universality that I believe in, that I call concrete universality.
Hmm.
And that concrete universality in Slavoj's writings is really based on two things: reconfiguring identity and recognizing the universal dimension of identity. And the other one, the other very important one, is linking the struggles of different communities around the world in solidarity politics.
Hmm.
Okay, because he says something really interesting in response to Huntington's Clash of
Please.
Civilization. He says that the most important clash is not between civilizations, but it's within civilizations
Hmm.
that we always try to cover up. And he says that the universal dimension that can connect us all together is really that internal fissure within each culture. We know, all of us know, that in my culture and your culture, it's not really homogenous and unified and great and just wonderful, Pollyanna kind of thing, but that it's full of fissures and contradictions. And this is the stable thing that unites all cultures together. And I think this is really important to the way that we can rethink global solidarity as the obverse sides of the same destructive process that we see happening today, whose name is obviously global capitalism.
How do you answer again Zizek's almost entering into a discourse that is seen as Islamophobic in the most recent period relative to immigration?
Yeah,
And that was a little bit, at least when I saw it, I was just taken back that he
yeah,
actually went
yeah,
into particularities, almost giving
yeah.
nod to nationalism.
I
How
know you
did
would
you read
ask
it?
me about this, but
Huh?
I know you would ask me about it. Well,
No, because we
I
both of us work on Islamophobia,
sure, sure,
attempting to
yes,
navigate this, which I
yeah.
thought, I was doing conference
Let
in
me,
Europe when he came out with
yeah.
those perspectives.
Let me just say, Hatem, that Slavoj's work on this issue is really misunderstood. When he published his piece in 2015 and the whole controversy erupted, I wrote a piece in these times called "Where Zizek's critic got it right and where they got it wrong." Usually one of the things that you have to understand about this guy is that if you really want to be a good friend of his, you have to criticize him. You have to be sort of showing both
Yeah,
sides of the argument, and it's not just simply about a sycophant. Oh my God, you are great. It doesn't work like this.
sure.
I think that part of the problem for me, and I may share another happy news, or piece of news. I just finished an article on, I finished a while back, but I received another acceptance letter from a philosophical journal on, it's called Reactualizing Hegel,
Mm-hmm.
Zizek, the Universality of Islam and its political potential. And I go back to one of the, I think, most important articles that Zizek wrote about Islam, called The Archives of Islam, taking
Mm-hmm. Yes.
another glance at the Archives of Islam. I think as every year you have someone who comes out and basically lashes at Slavoj and criticizes him. And what I have noticed, and I've wrote about it in this new article, a couple of footnotes, basically people tend to read what Slavoj says, and he uses a very technical Lacanian language that may seem simple and may seem commonsensical or an everyday language. But what he uses really is very theoretical, grounded in Lacanian discourse. So when he talks about, let's say, the refugee as a monstrous other, he's not calling refugees monsters. He's referring to a very specific idea in Lacan about the monstrosity of the other,
Mm-hmm.
okay, of the neighbor. Um, and so you have to sort of explain this. And again, what I felt in his article, people were reading his comments, confusing what he was saying for his critique of postmodern multiculturalism.
Mm.
Okay, and I point out three sort of points in the article from 2015, and then in this chapter, actually in this new article, I go in depth into how he theorizes Islam,
Mm-hmm.
and how he theorizes the universality of Islam, how he puts Islam by reactualizing Hegel. People argue also that Hegel was
Mm-hmm.
Islamophobic and whatever. And again, you have to reread Hegel in the context of his work. Slavoj manages to rehabilitate Hegel,
Mm-hmm.
and he inserts Islam back into the three monotheistic religions. And he actually does a very fascinating reading of the position of women in Islam and the suppressed sort of origins of Islam. I really encourage everyone to read that article, Another Glance at the Archives of Islam. And he relies on many, or some, let's say not many, but a few Arab and Islamic scholars like Fathi bin Salama,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote a book on psychoanalysis of Islam in French. So when I was doing the research for the article and I was reading what he was saying, my problem with him was that actually he wasn't sort of going far enough. Like there were sort of issues that he needed to criticize, but he didn't.
Mm.
And I thought that I could, like when he believes in the political value of political Islam. Okay, and I think he was too generous there. Like from the writings that I have been looking at and I've been sort of engaging and debating, and I sort of pointed out that to him.
I
You
think
are
the
being
challenge
really
is
generous.
for philosophers, intellectuals, that you're in the realm of ideas. And when those ideas are introduced into the markets of ongoing, unfolding political events, you get the crisis of how these finer scholarly points that you are debating at the philosophical level and how they get to be at least entering into a market that is highly fractured at this particular time. And I think that's the
Sure.
challenge that we're seeing.
Oh, and how do you really reach a wider audience? And again, it's really very deceptive because, Slava writes a lot and he publishes in RT and he publishes in the Philosophical Salon and he sort of tries to reach wider audiences. But there's always a risk that people would misinterpret what he's saying
Mm-hmm.
because that technical, theoretical concept into some sort of common colloquial parlance, which is not colloquial. You
Mm-hmm.
can't understand these terms unless you really went back to Lacan and to other scholars to understand what he's saying. But one thing that he keeps insisting on is defining everything in relation to the struggle of poor people in the global capitalist system. That is really one of the, I think, biggest merits of his work, that he insists on the critique of global capitalism almost in every book that he writes. He begins by sort of laying out, if you look at his books, and I have written a kind of a bibliographic essay on his work for the Oxford Bibliographies. If people don't know Zizek's work, I encourage you to go and read that introductory sort of chapter. Shameless self-promotion, but you can
Hmm.
forgive me. But when I was sort of writing the article, I sort of realized that I when I write, I do the opposite of what he's doing. Like I realized my strategy is completely the opposite, but we sort of meet in the middle, kind of. He begins his book by contextualizing his arguments within the critique of global capitalism. I begin with the what is called secondary contradictions.
Hmm.
I begin by a critique of gender politics, racial politics, homophobia, Islamophobia, and then I go on to relate it to how this is really a byproduct of the global capitalist dynamics that we see around us in the world. He does the opposite, and it's always sort of fascinating. Like when I started realizing, oh, look at there's a clear structure in the way that he really develops his books. Not the way that people say, it's really haphazard. It has no plan or whatever. He just writes and writes and writes. It's not true.
Yeah.
And he, sometimes part of it is that he gets into this sort of game and he tries to play with people's heads by telling them, yeah, I basically like his one of his best friends, Mladen Dolar,
Hmm.
said in one conference that Slavoj wrote one book and he still is writing that book. So all of the books that he wrote are. So Slavoj goes out and says, as someone mentioned, I have written only one book, and he keeps joking, like he keeps playing with people
Well, it's the
with the
same way
same
we say to
ideas.
PhD students is that you're going to write your thesis and then you're going to continue writing it with many iterations, many books coming out of it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Well, I
so,
mean, listen, and there is that sort of really organic connection
mhm,
between first book and the following one. I mean, there's always every new book he produces comes really from the last part of the book that he previously published because it's really connected. But going back to narrative, and people I mentioned Edward Said and the permission
mhm,
to narrate. And you know that the sort of thing about Palestinian narrative and reclaiming our voice, in that same webinar that I mentioned about Palestinian narrative and history and whatever, people really pointed out that we have to remember that Palestinians have been testifying and witnessing for their own history from early on in the struggle against the Zionist settler colonial project.
mhm,
So people talked about, the Hamilton Fission Congress in 1922.
mhm.
Dr. Fuad Shatara, he testified there.
Yeah.
So the Palestinians have been active in this sort of thing about narrating. We didn't need permission to narrate. We have been narrating. But, there are these certain theoretical things that stick with people and obviously with all due respect to Edward Said and his work, uh, people would not go beyond that. We really need to start, going back to the archives, to history, to other resources, and think about them. There's, you know, Palestinian studies is an expanding field. There are so many theories, so many approaches, fascinating stuff going on and happening, and we need to engage it beyond sort of um, simply fixating on one
Mhm.
critic or one theory or one character. There are so many things, and it's open really for debate.
And maybe I could segue into a discussion about the academic landscape in Palestine. Bethlehem University and Bir Zayt and Najah and other universities. Uh, how is the academic landscape looks like, and what are the some of the key works that are being done, and the challenges that you're facing, really trying to set up academic institutions in the hub of multi-layered settler colonialism that is experienced by the Palestinians. I remember my friend Mustafa Abu Swaya, whom you know, narrating to us just that the struggle for some students to come from the West Bank to attend his lecture were sometimes 4 hours or 5 hours, or sometimes the students are unable to cross the checkpoint and they have to listen to the lecture over the phone. So how does the academic landscape in Palestine looks like?
I think, to be honest with you, I mean, I grew up in Israel proper. I went to school in Firdis, my village, and then I finished my high school in Haifa. A shout out to the Orthodox Arab College. And then I did my BA and Master's at Haifa University before I moved to the United States. But I was sort of familiar a little bit with the struggle that my cousins or my father's cousins in Tul Karim, for example, in the camp had. And it was sort of shocking for me, again, from a young age, getting to know the stories of their struggle. But I, moving or teaching at Bethlehem and getting to know the realities um, of the education system there and the real struggle and the obstacles that people and students face on a daily life, students and teachers. Again, a shout out to my colleagues. I know some of them are here. They will probably be, better equipped to talk about their experiences, because I remember when I was studying the history of Bethlehem University, and we talked about the different, especially the Second Intifada, how people could not, attend classes, so they had to run all of these underground classrooms. So imagine a history of many years, 2 or 3 years that people held classes like that,
I
and
would,
and
I don't know
basement and
if there's
churches.
anybody that wrote a thesis about the underground education during the period of the Intifada, because it'll be fascinating, just uh, eh,
Definitely,
what were the pedagogy that was followed, what type of
definitely,
relationships. I think it'll be just a
definitely.
monumental piece of literature, just
Yeah,
on that.
absolutely. It's sort of in the oral narrative. I mean,
Yeah.
when you talk to people, you hear it, but I really haven't come across it in the literature per se. But it would be great if some of our colleagues undertake this project. It's very, very important, very, very educational, and important for documenting the process of the disintegration of Palestinian education and the continuing attacks on the integrity and quality of education in the occupied territories. So, my colleagues will talk about these interruptions. We'll talk about the excursions or incursions
Hmm.
of the Israeli military. I've seen a few. Bethlehem University has a video of its history, and one of the scenes there talk about or show the tanks that moved into Bethlehem, that destroyed property and on campus. Obviously, all of these measures, including the systematic restrictions on the mobility of students and faculty, right? You have an elaborate system of permanent and fly checkpoints. Our students, one of the things that our students keep narrating, especially our students from Jerusalem, because we have about 50% of our students come from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. The way that their feelings of humiliation every time they cross the checkpoint, because on those buses that they take from Bab el Amud to Bethlehem, the bus have to be stopped and everybody will be checked. And I remember, like in the beginning when I first came back to Palestine and I started teaching, hearing students talking about the soldier who went up the bus and pointed the gun at them. I mean, how can you even begin to teach
Hmm.
when a student is telling you? And I was like, "Are you okay?" You know, I was like terrified and shocked for her. And she was like, "Yeah, okay." It was just he pointed the gun and everything was okay after that. But just imagine how how traumatic these experiences are, and how they sort of fall onto the unconscious of these students. But they are resilient. They really, they are brilliant students. They are very smart and they are hard workers. But the challenges we face, now obviously it's different under Corona, under COVID-19, under all these closures. We are facing similar challenges that many people around the world face. But we have those realities on the ground. And enough just to talk about the segregation wall and to think about the Bantustans in Palestine, and how when you are trying to serve the needs of Palestinians in Bethlehem, it's only restricted to Bethlehem because many people in the north or the east, they cannot come to Bethlehem because of these draconian measures.
Mm.
You cannot drive 3-4 hours to come to class, and then especially for different segments of the student population, they have to go to commute back and forth. Students from Gaza, for example,
And
I
Gaza used to
remember
have to send a lot of students in the past to the
they
West
used to.
Bank.
And I
So
remember
now
there
you
was
had a complete also fragmentation of Palestinians into these
definitely,
cantons.
definitely. And then, when it comes also to scholars, just ask any Palestinian scholar. My colleagues, for example, when as Dean of Research, I send out all of these invitations from British universities or whatever, and they want to apply to a permit or a visa. Just imagine the arduous process of just getting a visa to go to travel, even though these countries are encouraging them. Even if you have people who are coming from abroad, if you an international scholar who's coming to Palestine, it's really difficult to get a visa for more than 3 months, even Fulbrighters.
Hmm.
We have stories of people, and I when I came back to Palestine, I was at Birzeit. I taught a couple of courses there. But after I left, an Iranian American professor won the Fulbright fellowship, and she went there, and she taught for a semester. Then she had to go out to renew the visa. The Israelis will not let her back in, so she had to stay in Jordan and teach online
Hmm.
for in the spring. So even winners of foreign scholarships that have good relationships with the Israeli government do not really get any preferential treatment,
Yeah, I think this is important
including America.
for people to realize, because in here we have, as you know, the cultural and academic boycott movement, and we're often, at least, are critiqued that you don't want academic freedom, that you don't want to have people having access to scholars, that what you are asking for these restrictions, but people don't realize that Palestinians do not enjoy the basic academic freedom, freedom of movement, freedom of scholars to come in and out, to do research uninterrupted. And I think this is very important just to understand the depth of the barriers that are aside from the physical barrier, the physical wall. There are these structures that really are limiting the Palestinians' ability to engage academically.
And the ideological sort of also structures that accompany these physical measures. Think about what happened to Palestinian education after the Oslo Accords.
Mhm.
Recently, and at the Bethlehem University Journal, we published a couple of last year, our last issue was an issue on education and culture and the humanities. And one of the articles by my friend, Professor Bassem Raed, who wrote a very good book on the history of Palestine called Hidden History. Um, Bassem wrote an article about the Palestinian curriculum
Mm.
and how distorted it is when it comes to the history of Palestine itself. Because of the international donors, Palestinian scholars writing the curriculum have to twist and distort the information, the facts
Mhm.
that they need to provide in a book, in a history book or a geography book. To the extent that there was once a scandal, I remember it was maybe a third grade geography book where Bethlehem was drawn on the beach next to Gaza.
Mhm.
I mean, like, how could that happen? It's really incredible. But the whole thing about the pressure, international pressure on Palestinians to meet certain objectives and goals and to renounce violence and to do all of these things. So it leads to that sort of watering down of education. It has led to really the destruction of even thinking at the level of thinking, because people are I mean, that's another thing, the level of fear.
Mm.
As a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I've always written. I've never been interrogated for what I write. I write as an academic. I don't write sort of anything that is out of sort of bounds. When I was in the States, I continued writing, and I do the same thing. I try to be as objective as I can. I try to be to weigh in on different arguments. But I have heard it many times. Colleagues of mine would ask me, "Are you not afraid of
Mm.
writing this?" And I really, it shocked me, because I was, I believed, like, okay, I have academic freedom as an academic, as an intellectual, but there has been a history of 60 years of repression where people were not allowed to speak, where, teachers were arrested, were interrogated. And that carries on, orally, that sort of history, the oral history of what you have, of what happened, can scare people. And it does really scare people. But that doesn't mean that it's all sort of, again, you talked about the crackdown on Palestinian academics. And I, you know, it shocks me. Like I wrote about it in a recent book on economic freedom in Palestine,
Hmm.
a talk that I gave in Germany a couple of years back as a keynote address. And I was trying to establish, like, to criticize mimetic theory. It was a conference on mimetic theory.
Hmm.
I was trying to criticize how mimetic theorists have really distorted the history of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, that many of them went into anti-Semitic, really vile
Hmm.
Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. And I was sort of trying to show how vile it is. And I used the quotes from people with the name of the authors there.
Hmm.
And people, they shut me down, like, what are you saying? What the heck are you talking about?
Yeah.
We cannot listen to this anymore. But I'm trying to criticize, I'm trying to reach, believing in that politics of solidarity. I wanted to reach a point where I can say, let's understand what's going on in Palestine within the dynamics of the global capitalist system. But even that, and that goes back to the point that I mentioned earlier. It really becomes difficult to really realize what Palestinian scholars and pro-Palestinian advocacy group can say without being condemned as anti-Semitic. There's nothing that you can say that almost doesn't sound anti-Semitic. Even the two-state solution is now anti-Semitic.
Well, if you say Palestine, you're being accused that you are denying the existence of Israel, and therefore this is a form of anti-Semitism.
There
So
you
the
go. I
only
mean,
way is that you have to say, I recognize Israel right to exist as a Jewish state with self-determination, without mentioning anything relative to Palestine, and that's the scope of, if you want to call it, debate. Basically, you have to accept your self-erasure. You have to accept the complete. Almost demolition of Palestine and Palestinians as a way for you to enter into the scope of conversation in many parts of the debates. And unfortunately, at least right now, is bleeding into the Arab world
oh yeah,
with the
definitely.
current dynamics, which I think we need to begin to speak about Arab or Muslim Zionists in the same way that we have Christian Zionism. Now that's where we are confronting.
Yeah, I mean, I think my piece. I have written a piece called "The Subject Supposed to Believe." Again, using another Zijikian idea
Yeah.
to talk about the new iteration of subjects who believe for Zionism. And
Mm.
I talk about Muslim Zionists. I published the article in, I think it was the Palestine Chronicle,
Hmm.
about 4 or 5 years ago. But to me, it's very, very kind of disturbing to see that on many levels. On the manipulation of Quranic verses, on deliberate misinterpretation of the Quran, or the history of the Prophet, or whatever. But this is where I told Ilan Pape once. I was given, we were both invited to speak in Italy, at a conference in Edward Said. And, I mentioned to Ilan that, the thing that he says all the time about most Israelis do not believe in God, but they believe that He gave them Palestine.
Hmm.
What Zizek says is that belief is reflexive. You have to have someone else to believe for you. Even
Hmm.
if you don't believe, you ask your parents, irda alay,
Hmm.
okay? Blessings, give me your blessings, or whatever. So people always ask or anticipate others to believe for them. And this is really what's going on with the Zionist movement. They really need people to believe for them. The Zionist Christians believed for them for many years, and now we have this renewed energy of Muslim Zionists who are believing for
Hmm.
the Zionists and their narratives, even though it's discredited by most Zionist archaeologists and historians.
And
But
they
we are,
added,
this is really the difficult situation that I see myself
yeah.
if I'm talking to my, friends, Muslim friends. It really becomes a problem When Zionist historians and archaeologists tell you that there's no historical evidence for Moses and David and Solomon and whatever, but Palestinians cannot deny that because it's in the Quran,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to repeat and recycle the same biblical mythologies that underpin the Zionist narrative in their own stories.
Mm.
And it becomes a real issue. I mean, it's a real dilemma and a real a concern how you see this discourse developing. But they need them. And
Mm.
now it's obviously taking a new level of action, a new level of practice and political machinations, the
And
exclusion of the Palestinians altogether, and the idea of the deal of the century, obviously, is to sort of liquidate the Palestinian struggle for freedom altogether.
yeah, I was surprised at just the most recent past in the social media and the public discourse, the blaming of the Palestinians that basically are digging up some of the old Zionist narrative and deploying it again, and being seen that are some Arab and Muslims that are actually heaving blame and scorn on the Palestinians rather than actually uh, the solidarity that should have been there.
But this is where Hatem, as going back to the first point that I was raising,
Mm-hmm.
what do we do? How do we sort of reframe this narrative if we have one, right? And how do we sort of reconstruct it to be able to deal with these challenges and obstacles? We cannot continue repeating the same story when even some of our brethren,
Mm-hmm.
exclude us from that sort of narrative and story itself. I mean, you have heard all of these memes and jokes about how they're teaching the history of the Jews in Saudi Arabia now. It's just, again, it's kind of scary because there's nothing really scientific about it, but it's all sort of hyped. Sounds like like there's that sort of silencing of the Palestinian voice as a way of forming those relations with the Israelis. Again, I understand the geopolitical problem. I understand what people are saying about the Iranian threat or whatever. But there is, and this is where the whole trend in current global capitalism
Mm-hmm.
that we see, the trend of the rise of authoritarian capitalists like Trump and Bolsonaro and all of these populist leaders who work in cahoots with all of these dictators and around the world. There is no shame in this. Actually, this is their role model. And that shift that we see, some of my friends, I also, again, wrote an article about Trump in 2016, looking at what he's doing in the context of this shift
Mm.
towards authoritarian capitalism. And it was obvious to me what was going on. And now, everybody, after the debate and the first debate in particular, people are like, what was going on here? We need different frames of narrative in order to be able to explain what was going on. And well, it's clear, you have a shift towards authoritarian capitalism and someone who is really trying his best to stay within the traditional notion of liberal democracy. The clash is clear. It's not just simply a clash of personalities or, the hot-tempered infantile Trump or the mature. It's an ideological clash
Mm-hmm.
par excellence, right? It's an ideological clash that you can see that clear shift. I am the authoritarian leader here, and I want to be in office another 16 years. We don't know now what will happen after he gets out of the hospital, but um, but again, what I'm trying to say is that there are these global trends. We need to be savvy about them, and we cannot have that sort of belief in the big other, someone on a white horse that will come and save us. Palestinians or the Palestinian Authority in the beginning had so much hope that Trump was that sort of big white hope that was coming to save us from all of this, and the Palestinians are going to have their own state and whatever. I mean, come on, do not expect or wait for
Mm.
people to come and save you or rescue you or whatever. We have to start thinking seriously. about how to reach out to different communities around the world, including Arabs and Muslims and Arab Christians and whoever, because we cannot take anyone for granted. You have to really work hard on it. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned, Noor Arakat's book, one thing that I really like about her book, Justice for Some, and if our friends here did not read the book, please read it. It's so meticulous in documenting the way that Israelis have played with international law to justify everything they are doing. How they incorporated the state of exception that was outlined in the Balfour Declaration and the mandate, and applied it to the emergency rule up to 66. And then how they played with all of they interpreted the law in such a way that justified everything they're doing. I mean, part of the problem that today you see shifts in terminology. Some people call it occupation, other people talk about apartheid regime, other talk about colonial project, is because the status of the occupation is disputed.
Yep.
The occupied territories are called disputed territories. And the Israelis managed to relieve themselves of all responsibility for it. And now, the trend now in the way that the Israelis frame the Palestinian struggle for freedom is by saying it's an armed conflict short of war. Okay? So now you cannot even defend yourself, because if you defend yourself, even if they attack you, you are violating international law. The only time that she says Palestinians did something right was in the 70s when Arafat spoke at the UN. And they managed to sort of introduce a law that allowed Palestinians to speak about self-determination without any preconditions. But we have to, I mean, this is really the kind of scholarship that we need. Meticulous scholarship that goes back historically to the archives, reads it well, situated in a good theoretical context, and she works with Duncan Kennedy's work on, she called it legal work, I think. You know, we have, and this is my sort of message to my Palestinian friends and researchers, we have to become part of the international global conversation about Palestine. It's really sad that most people who write about Palestine today are either international scholars who come to Palestine with, you know, doing helicopter research, with all due respect to everyone, for a few months and then go back and write books about it. And the Palestinians themselves cannot write that narrative. I understand, you know, I was watching Julie Basha talk about one of her films and how she says that, you know, it's really sad for her that Palestinians cannot make her films, but because she is Brazilian, that she can do these movies and people can watch them. But beyond that, we need to speak the language that academics, at least for me as an academic, that other academics are speaking. We need to frame our narratives within those theories, whether you agree with them or not. You can contest them, you can argue with them, you can redefine them, you can expand on them. Okay, so there are many things that we can do in order to become central to the global conversation about Palestine in particular. Culture, history, identity, literature, economy, all of it.
So maybe looking at the big picture again, especially in the political arena, where do you see the Palestinian body politic going, considering the fragmentation that we have? And what is, again, the role of the intellectual or scholar like yourself or others at this critical juncture? Because that seems to be one of the most difficult issues that we're still are confronting at this point.
It's really tough. I mean, sometimes, you know, I usually say that I avoid talking about solutions because it's not really an easy solution. But Palestine is a kind of an interesting example of and why it is important to speak and talk about Palestine still, even though I don't think that we are exceptional in any way. But at least there is one way in which the situation in Palestine is exceptional, is, as again, I'm borrowing from Slavoj Žižek's analysis, is that all pragmatic solutions in Palestine have failed. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any pragmatic solution that will work in here. But part of the problem, I think, with what we see today in the political leadership is that sort of attachment to traditional Westphalian ideas of states that are based on notions of modernity that are very racialized, that glorify notions of implicitly notions of whiteness, that will end up requiring some sort of notion of an other to be able to function.
Mm.
I mean, with all of this sad situation we are in, I may be like Emil Habibi, a peace optimist. I'm not like, the Afro
Hmm.
pessimist in this sense. I'm a peace optimist. There's an occasion to sort of rethink liberation in a new way. We really need to think hard. How to do it, I really don't know. Today, I was talking to Marie, my wife, and I was sort of saying maybe what we needed is an extension of the psychoanalytic scene, because one of the things that I'm working on in this new book, Rethinking Palestine, is those fundamental fantasies through which we filter our lives and our histories.
Mm.
And how do we do it? I really don't know. I mean, it's really a tough thing. And as an academic, as you said, Hatem, I try to engage in many of these debates. I try to inform and educate people about the things that are happening here. I try to provide it in a format that people can find accessible. But at the same time, it's really tough to make that change. And I use the example today of Trump. Look at what Trump is doing and how people
Mm.
are still attached. There's something that at that symbolic level clicks with people, with Americans, when it comes to Trump and beyond America, where his symbolic value
Hmm.
clicks with people at that sort of level of fantasy in the psychoanalytic sense. So as a result of that, whatever he says, people are going to defend him. Now I'm just waiting. I'm just really waiting. I'm trying just to see the first report on the conspiracy theory about Trump's illness.
Oh, that's already is out.
I bet I haven't
Yes.
seen it, but
Yeah,
I'm
no,
waiting
it's
for it.
already out. They said that it was a
I
left.
knew it was coming, but I wasn't sure when or
Yeah, yeah.
what,
Almost 2 hours
which form
after,
it's going to take.
2 hours after he announced it, it's like a whole conspiracy that they set him up on the stage during the debate. And as such, this is what the conspiracy of the COVID-19 directed at Trump. Maybe just to take us through the conclusion, what are things that people can do both to help in Bethlehem University, some of the programs that you guys can offer? Is there an Arabic program that people can come for summer learning? I think there are many people that will be watching that actually would have possibly the opportunity maybe for a summer program, or if somebody have also study online study program, or some of our faculty member that from abroad that would like to engage, by all means, I think this is the realm of us to be creative and see where are the gaps that people could fit in.
Well, I mean, again, now we are in a different sort of political situation and reality that is determined and conditioned by, COVID-19 pandemic. So the dynamics have really changed on the ground. I know I'm teaching a course this semester on the power of text, and when I was planning or was I was asked to teach the course, some American students from Notre Dame were supposed to be enrolled in the course, but they couldn't show up, obviously, because of the pandemic. I mean, things are really changing, but there are these opportunities that we see now in these webinars. I mean, we have endless number of webinars, and many Palestinian organizations and groups are organizing and coordinating some of these. So I encourage people to join them, to have these conversations with people, to get to know more about what's going on the ground. We have an Arabic program, but unfortunately, unless you are on the ground here or there, I mean, in Bethlehem,
Mhm.
you're not going to be able to enroll in it. Maybe things will change. We'll have more of these programs. Remember that Bethlehem is a small school, university. It's only
Mhm.
3,000 people. We are not as big as a Najah or a Quds University. which have more international programs. But we do our best to attract international students and international faculty members. When tourism was, alive back then, a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
You used to have a lot of groups of people who would come to visit the university, meet students. We would organize these tours for them in the Office of External Relations, I guess. Um, the situation again is a little bit difficult, but one of the groups, especially if we have academics in the group, PARC is a very good resource that you should consult. They always have activities and they have always lists of the Palestinian American, I think, Research Center.
Mm-hmm.
They also offer many grants for research on Palestine. And they used to organize these groups of academics from the United States in particular for about 2 weeks. To travel to Palestine, to visit universities, to meet with professors and students, get to know what's going on the ground. It's very important that people can see for themselves what's going on. As usually I say to my students, do not take anything that even what I say to you for granted. You have to go and see it for yourself. You have to do it yourself. And it's really important for people to engage these activities and also be somehow politically active. I'm not going to be saying go out and vote. My shirt says it's your turn or decide now or never. But there are things that you can do. I mean, Biden, for example, calls himself Zionist. He says I'm a Zionist. But I read an article today in the Jerusalem Post that was very vicious in their attack on Biden and his position on Israel. So people need to really educate themselves, get to know the picture, and you have a lot of people who are, who are people of conscience, who know what's right, and they can see what the wrong that is going here. Nobody wants the destruction of anyone. We want that a change in the way that people live for the better in both Palestine and Israel. And this is really what we need to stay focused on in the end, rethinking liberation for all Palestinians and Israelis. That, I think, to me, if you stick to that kind of decolonial mentality for everyone, I think we'll be able to think about it in productive ways. But how to do it and what to do, I really don't have a program. I don't know how to do it. I'm just thinking about it like you and everybody else.
Well, I have my colleague Robert Bishara who works with us. Maybe he's at New Mexico University.
Yes.
He says, Salam Jamil and Dr. Bazian, what is the relevance of Zizak work for rethinking Palestine and liberation? So maybe if you could just make a few comments
Sure.
Robert will not get upset on me that I didn't get him. Good to see you, Robert.
Yes,
Robert just came out with his book and definitely is a colleague that works with us.
He's a wonderful guy. We know Robert and his work. Salam, Robert. So Robert, I would say that Zizak had done really great in terms of explaining and analyzing the brutality of the Zionist settler colonial project, the Israeli policies in the occupied territories. He really engaged this in quite a few books of his. In one of my articles, I talk about Zizak's writings. One of the articles that I wrote about Islam and Zizak, I also talk about Zizak's position on Palestine. And actually, in my book on my chapter on academic freedom, I used the Zizakian framework. And one of the reviewers of the book was kind of, how dare you, use Zizak in this context? He said this and that. But again, I really found it ironic that in a book about academic freedom, that you're going to silence people who are using Zizak's work. Actually, he's very radical when it comes to the critique of Israeli policies. He doesn't hesitate about, like, when I asked him a couple of times about having talks with my students, and he really said, I will do it, and I will pay the ticket, I will come, you don't have to worry about it, just pick me up from the airport. That's what he said. He's really, in terms of his work, especially in his book called in Living in These Times.
Mm.
He has a whole chapter on the occupation and the draconian measures that the Israelis use to control the Palestinians. And he had done it in many other books. And again, as I said, I disagree with him on some issues. I agree with him on others. I understand where he's coming from. You know, obviously he's a European or from Europe. He has a history of a specific history about Jewish European relations that I will not ever, you know, judge. I know that, for example, when it comes to the BDS, there was once a controversy over his position because he would speak at non-governmental institutions in Israel as long as they issue statements condemning the occupation. So he does what is called partial
Mm.
BDS, in contrast, for example, to what Judith Butler does, you know, total. I mean, that doesn't for me. I would not. It will not make me lose respect for Slavoj. I understand it, and he says, you know, as a European, you have to understand when you talk about boycotting Jews, it comes from a specific history in Europe that makes him uncomfortable. So as a Palestinian, I'm not going to stand like, you know, a master signifier basically saying, you know, you're going to do this or not. I respect his decision because I know that he stands for justice and he stands for freedom and liberty for all. And that's clear from his writing. And again, you know, I disagree with him on some of his interpretations when the COVID-19 pandemic erupted. You know, Slavoj writes very fast, and he published a book like within the first month of the pandemic on COVID-19, and he used an example of Netanyahu offering, you know, this branch of olive to Abbas. Let's work together on. So Slavoj used that as an example of the utopian possibilities that we can
Mm.
see come out of the COVID. And I wrote to him and I said, you know, Slavoj, are you really serious? So I sent him a couple of articles. One of them was a very good article on the treatment of Palestinian workers in Israel. And he was shocked. He wrote it back. He wrote me back and said, Jamil, I'm really shocked. I don't know how I wrote that sort of thing about Netanyahu and Abbas. But again, these are things that when you're writing in the heat of the moment, you might not think about it, and you want to see something really
But I
good
think
coming out of what's happening. So
not to nuance, but I think there is an aspect relative to Western writing about Palestine and also the global South, that there is this assumption often that these are the moments that shows there is a rapprochement between, let's say, Israel or Zionism and the colonized subject. And these moments gets to be reinterpreted in what I consider to be the dominant narrative, that overall, taking the good and the bad, Zionism and state of Israel is a good Western project. We just need to fix it. So these moments fit into this dominant narrative that continues to be
sure,
there.
but again, you know, he insists all the time on saying, I mean, he's very, like, one of the things that I like about his writing about Israel and Palestine, his critique of what he calls Zionist anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
He actually argues that the main purveyor of anti-Semitism today in the world is Zionism. He talks about, look at how many Jewish activists, pro-Palestinian Jewish activists, are persecuted by the Israeli state. He talks about how the Israeli government attacked George Soros. He talks about the complicity with between the Israeli government and all of these religious fanatic Christian Zionists that Trump brought with him to the inauguration of the embassy in
Mhm.
Jerusalem. I mean, he's not blind to this, but again, maybe there's an inkling. You know, he wants to see something happen,
Yeah.
something sort of beyond what we are accustomed to. But again, you know, he was sort of, you know, big enough to admit that, oh my God, I made a mistake.
Sure.
Okay, and again, but you have also to remember that as a European and himself Zizek, because of the kind of writing that he writes, he was attacked viciously just a couple of months back by an Israeli organization based in a Jewish settlement very close to Jerusalem.
Mm.
I mean, they waged a war against him and they attacked him viciously. And I mean, honestly, he was freaking out about how they are trying to tarnish his name to accuse him of being anti-Semite. And many newspaper outlets were taking up this charge and repeating it. And he wanted a chance to speak out and to speak up and to speak out and to talk to people about the simply the trash that these people were publishing. So also you have to understand that he was also put on a defensive kind of measure
Mm.
in some of these conversations. But again, anyone again the idea, the thing about this two-state solution. I mean, he said it clearly. People don't want me to speak about the two-state solution because that's anti-Semitic. I mean, he's not really oblivious. When I was in Germany giving the talk, it happened that he was there also giving a talk. So I went with Marie and Selma, my wife and daughter, to say hi to him and to listen to his talk. And I told him, today in the talk, they shut me down. They wouldn't let me speak. And he was really outraged. And when I share with him these things, he told me, Jamil, this is important. You have to talk about this. You have to write about it. You have to
Mm.
let the world know. So he knows that there's something wrong, and he's really supporting, the Palestinian rights, and he wants to see something positive happening because he also cares about the his Jewish friends and the Jewish state and all of that because of the horrible history
Mm.
that the Jewish people went through in the Holocaust in Europe.
Thank you, Jamil. I had to ask that last question for Robert. It's really was a pleasure. For anyone that's listening, make sure to visit the Bethlehem University website. Look at the program. For anyone that is able to support any of the projects at Bethlehem University, by all means, universities in Palestine are really one of the important pillars of our civil society, and really is one of the jewels for the Palestinians, the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure that supports and make sure that the academic work is being done, the scholarship, the research. And I know that Professor Jamil Khader, as a dean at Bethlehem University, definitely there are many things that they want to do. Your support and your help is always can make a difference. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Jamil. It's definitely, this is one of many. Inshallah, we will have many opportunities. We will share this on YouTube. It's already on Facebook, and we'll share it on YouTube, and I'll send the link for everyone that attended this webinar. Thank you, and thank you for all
Thank you
those who
very much,
attended.
everyone, for coming and for sharing the comments and the notes. Hatem, thank you so much for organizing this.
You're welcome. Thank you for accepting the invitation. We wish everybody in Palestine the best. May you all be in good health, safe and protected and prosperous, and give salams to all of our people in there. And for me, always give salam to all of our scholars and colleagues that do some great work.
Thank you so much. And to you all, of course. We all need it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Salam.